Okay, hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us here tonight for our first ever World Affairs Live event. I'm broadcasting from here at my apartment in Manchester, New Hampshire, and we're very excited to have Brigadier General Spalding with us from his home as well. Many of you have attended our in-person programming before, but unfortunately, due to the Corona-19 crisis, we are currently unable to continue those types of events. So while we had Brigadier General Spalding coming up for today, unfortunately that obviously is not happening, but we're very excited to be able to host this virtually, and we hope that you enjoy this new format of programming from us. Certainly a difficult time for us all, and we truly do hope you're staying well, healthy, and safe at this time. For those of you who are not familiar with the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, my name is Tim Horgan, and I'm the Executive Director of this great organization. It is our mission to help people better understand the important global issues that face our state, communities, and nation. As the current pandemic shows us, now is not the time to turn a blind eye to what is going on around the world. Quickly, events that occur in faraway places can and will come to the United States and drastically affect our own lives. This is not only true with new pathogens, but also with global terror networks, cyber conflicts, election interference, and a host of other challenges. As the world continues to connect, the responsibilities of citizens to be aware of international events grows with it. We cannot forget our duties to remain informed citizens, even in times of crisis. It is for these reasons that the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire is committed to continuing to bring interesting programming in different online formats. Tonight is the first of what we hope to be many online discussions that we will look to have with you all. We have also rescheduled our April 22nd event with Dr. Soner Kagapte to an online format. He will be talking about the rise in authoritarianism in Turkey. We have also worked to continue our monthly podcast series, bringing you interesting discussions on important global topics. If you have not already listened in, the Global and the Granite State podcast is definitely worth a listen. People in 13 different countries and 25 states here in the US have tuned in, and you should too. We will be releasing our next episode on April 1st, and you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, or on our website. You can also ask your smart speaker to play Global and the Granite State for an even easier way to listen in. Finally, the Council is looking for other ways in which we might be able to bring additional online programming to our audiences, so please stay tuned to our social media and email blasts. I also wanted to mention that the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire is a nonprofit membership organization that relies heavily on community support for our survival. We certainly need your help to continue to bring great speakers like this to the state and to make programs like this available. The more we can educate people about other cultures, countries, and international issues, the more we can move towards a peaceful and prosperous world. Without a doubt, it's important stuff that we're talking about here, and the types of programs cannot happen without you. So I will ask you to please consider taking the time after this program to either become a member of the organization or to donate to help us continue our important work. We truly need your help. All right, now on to the boring legal part of the presentation. As a nonpartisan organization, the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire does not support or endorse candidates' policies or ideas. We are here as a platform for discussion on international affairs and want our audience to draw their own conclusions from these presentations. Therefore, the thoughts and ideas expressed in this program are those of the speaker and his alone. They do not necessarily represent those of the council, its board of directors, staff, or supporters. Okay, with that out of the way, I would like to take a moment to thank our community supporters who have worked to make this event possible. Thank you so much to the John Bickford Foundation, Charlie and Barbara Bickford, Stephen and Karen Barndollar, and Helen Taft and Peter Bowman. Your support has been invaluable in making this program a possibility. We really appreciate the help that they provided to the council and hope you will join us in thanking them for making it possible. Please note, we are going to have some time for questions and answers at the end of the General's presentation. So please do send along those questions throughout the event. We will be taking questions via our council web email address, council@wacnh.org, or via our Facebook and Twitter feeds. We hope to get through as many of them as possible, so please do send them along early and often. I would now like to take a moment to introduce our speaker tonight, Brigadier General Robert Spalding. Brigadier General Spalding retired from the U.S. Air Force after serving as a B-2 stealth bomber pilot and commander of the only B-2 bomber unit in the nation. He has over 26 years of experience in the Defense and State Departments, and as Senior Director for Strategy to the President, he was the Chief Architect of the framework for national competition in the Trump administration's national security strategy. He's lived in mainland China, both as an Olmsted Scholar and as a senior defense official at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. He has also traveled extensively throughout Asia, giving him direct insights into the region. Currently, he works as a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. We're very excited to be welcoming Brigadier General Spalding to this program. General, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. It's so good to be here. I wish I was there live in person. Of course, we're all doing our part to slow the spread of this terrible pandemic and flatten the curve, and hopefully we'll get the nation back on its feet and back to growing our economy again. This has been tough for families. It's not just tough for the people that are infected by the virus. It's also tough for the small business owners and in particular their employees who really need those jobs. So hopefully we can get back on our feet as soon as possible. And I pray for everybody that they're safe and well and they're well cared for. We're going to talk about China, and I have the great honor or blessing to have spent a lot of time in China. But prior to that, really didn't know much about it. So in 2001, I was selected for a program called the Olmsted Scholar Program, which really allows for military officers, primarily mid-level officers, to go live abroad and study at a university and study a foreign language. So I spent a year learning Chinese at the Defense Language Institute, and then I spent 2 years living in Shanghai, studying at Tongji University. And I have to say it was one of the most life-changing events that I've ever had. My family, of course, was with me, my wife and 2 sons, and we enjoyed living in Shanghai with the Chinese people. I learned all about the history, the culture, the language, the geography. We traveled all over the country. And it was an exciting time because China had just entered the WTO, and all of my neighbors were building factories for Fortune 500 companies in the Shanghai Special Economic Zone. It was a vibrant, incredible place. Of course, I had broadband at my house back then, faster than I could get back at home, my home in a rural base back in America in Knob Noster, Missouri. And but there was no firewall. There was no, heavy digital presence by the Chinese government. Of course, they had the People's Armed Police and the Ministry of State Security, but I didn't really see them very much. It was overall just a wonderful experience. And I told my wife as we were leaving in 2004 that I really wanted, after I retired from the Air Force, I wanted to come back to China and work there because it was such an exciting place to be. And of course, I went back to my time in the Air Force flying the B-2. But as I would have staff jobs and as I rose in rank, I would inevitably be pulled back into China policy. So I worked at the Office of Secretary of Defense and worked on the first archive agreement between our military and the Chinese military in trying to find the missing from the Korean War, because the Chinese, the People's Liberation Army had control of the prisoner of war camps. And so I negotiated the archive agreement with the first archive agreement with the People's Liberation Army. And those interactions were generally positive. and reinforce my feeling that, U.S.-China relations were on a positive trajectory, and that we should continue to pursue a close, relationship with China. Then, as I finished up my time flying the B-2, unbeknownst to me, the Air Force were at that time considering to move me towards being the defense attaché in Beijing, which required a number of positions prior to that to essentially strengthen my my bona fides for applying for that prestigious position. So I started at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City as a senior military fellow. I spent a year in New York meeting with many people that I'd never interacted before, many people in economics and finance and business and industry that really helped broaden my understanding of economics and finance, particularly how they impacted our global economy. And I made a lot of friends and a lot of connections. And I took that knowledge and those connections with me to the Joint Staff to be the senior advisor on China to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. So I led a team of China-focused professionals. So these were officers like me that had studied the language, that had studied the Chinese Communist Party and the government, and actually worked in the embassy. So unlike me, they actually had much more background and information about the government itself. I had a lot of understanding of the people and the population and the culture and the language and the history, but I had very little of the system itself. And so we started to look at then, as I got to the Pentagon in 2014, at this competition, because what was happening at the time were the challenges with the islands in the South China Sea. So interspersed with that, we were looking at the competition just in terms of the military balance in the region. And one of the things that I quickly came to realize was we were far less capable in terms of military capability in that region than I really understood us to be. We had been so focused, and I myself focused in flying the B-2 on the Middle East, and much less so on the Pacific theater. I really didn't understand how much their military power had grown in the region. And so I started to look at that military power. And then I brought in kind of my understanding of what was happening economically. And you could see that their military power was growing year over year and would continue to grow. And yet our economy wasn't keeping pace with that growth. So because of purchasing power parity, their military was growing faster than any ability our budget would have to compete. And so I realized we had a rapidly growing military imbalance, but the competition wasn't really about military, it was about economics. In fact, because our economy had essentially stagnated compared to theirs, then we were going to have a big problem maintaining our place in the world. And so for those 2 years while I was at the Pentagon, I tasked my team with trying to think about how do we protect the United States in this type of world where you have this rising power that has a greater military potentially than us in the future. And I would say today that they've achieved that. And during that time, in the fall of 2014, I continued to receive data from the people I'd met in New York. And one fine day, a briefing lands in my inbox, and I open it up, and it's a briefing that's been prepared by one of our top 5 audit firms, and it essentially documented vignette after vignette of how the Chinese Communist Party had used various state tools to go after companies in the United States across the country, across industries and markets, diverse, almost just about any that you could think about that were leading our economy, and used the tools of the state to go after those businesses. And at that point, I realized that, okay, not only did we have an economic competition going on, that we had a more or less an economic war going on that was really hidden from the view of government. And the reason it was hidden from the view of government was because that businesses were very timid about coming forward with challenges with regard to China, because they worried about the impact either to their share price or the impact of the Chinese Communist Party penalizing them for coming forward. And so these vignettes had been sanitized to protect the company's names, but the stories were shocking and revealed tradecraft that was only capable, only a nation state could be capable of using. And so at that point, we really started to dig deeper into this economic component of the competition. Of course, we were focused on the industrial base and how many of our subcomponents for a lot of our weapon systems were only resourced in China. And so we started focusing on that. And really, as we began that process, we started to brief the senior leaders of the Pentagon and other military commands throughout the United States to let them know what we had found and to seek their guidance. And there was a general reaction that I got. There's two reactions. And one was, oh my gosh, this is bad. And the second reaction was, well, this isn't my job. My job is to either fight tonight or do something else. It's not to be worried about economic or finance or trade. That's somebody else. And so we engaged the State Department, and we engaged the FBI, the Department of Justice, Treasury, U.S. Trade Representative, Commerce, all of these different departments and agencies, and tried to look for, who was responsible for dealing with this this predatory economic behavior that was causing the erosion of our defense industrial base and our science and technology dominance. And the answer was, well, nobody is. And frequently the answer was, well, because China's not an adversary. And so I recognized then that we had a severe problem. And so we focused for those intervening 2 years while I was at the Pentagon at trying to come up with understanding more deeply the challenge, but also thinking about how would we construct a strategy that might reverse what was the outcome, where we weren't essentially being eroded in our industrial base and our science and technology dominance. And so we focus on that, things that were going on during the time. You may have heard things like the third offset or the effort to take commercial technology and apply it to military use. These are some of the ways that the Pentagon was trying to attempt to alleviate the situation. Of course, what we began to realize is that China was so in our corporate sector that divining technology that they didn't already have access to because of their relationships with our corporations was actually quite difficult. And they were in our labs and they were in our universities, and they were any time that we had a university affiliated research center where they were doing Defense Department research, then you would have also Chinese students that were brought into or that were sent there to study under those professors and be parts of some of those research efforts. So this was a big challenge, we realized, and we really just started to try to understand the broad nature of that. In 2016, late 2016, I went to be the defense attaché in Beijing. I was actually there a week before they took the unmanned underwater vehicle, the little glider that they stole from in front of one of our destroyers, and I negotiated the return of that with the Chinese government. And then a few months later, I was brought into the White House, really in the first year of the administration, and I was brought in for the express purpose of working on the national security strategy. So I brought a lot of the work that we had done in the prior years at the Pentagon and a lot of those connections, and we use that to construct what we believe is a fundamentally different national security strategy that's been played out really since the first quarter of 2018. And what it seeks to do is essentially deal with the fact that in a globalized, internet-connected world, that national security is far more about data and economics than it is about geography. And this really kind of has touched off a two-front war within the national security establishment and within the Washington, D.C. Beltway. And that is, the first one is really about how do you define national security. There's a lot of people that want to continue to essentially define it using geography, and the weapons of that competition are really tanks and planes and ships and submarines. And there's this other definition, and more people in the national security sphere in Washington, D.C. are beginning to adopt and understand it, and that is about data and economics, and really using economic and financial incentives and inducements to curry geopolitical favor. And that has been how China has become so dominant on the international scene, whether it be the United Nations, the World Bank, or the WTO, and really how they've essentially stolen a march on the spread of democracy since the end of the Cold War quite effectively. And then the second competition is really, or the conflict within the Washington, D.C. in particular, is this idea that corporate America wants to continue to sell products to China, to continue to be involved with China, even though they understand that they are fighting a losing battle because, number one, China doesn't allow an equal playing field economically in their own country, and they subsidize their companies internationally. So they really think of the world in terms of two markets. There's a domestic market and an international market. They protect the domestic market with tariff and non-tariff barriers, and they subsidize their companies in the international market in order to grow global champions. And they believe over time that it's much more important to be economically dominant than it is to be militarily dominant. And in fact, military dominance flows from economic superiority. So this is the competition that's been going on and the challenges that we face within Washington, D.C., and how a lot of the time we're seeing in the news media kind of a back and forth. You know, should we have tariffs or should we not have tariffs? A lot of that has to do with the disagreement on how you define national security. Does economic security underpin national security, or is it an element of itself? Should we do industrial policy? Now, these are influenced by the commercial sector, which believes that, you know, we should have just open markets. In a lot of ways, that competition epitomizes how we've, from a foreign policy perspective, approached our relationship with China. We believed that open markets lead to wealth and wealth leads to democracy, and that if we were open to China, that as they grew in power and strength, that the Chinese Communist Party would eventually liberalize and China would become more friendly to the international order. But instead, what we found is the exact opposite. And this is some of the lessons that I was learning during this 2 years in 2014 to 2016. While I knew China, the Chinese people, the culture, the history, I didn't know the party. I didn't understand the system. So I read thousands of pages, documents like the Chinese Communist Party Constitution, document number 9. I read Xi Jinping's writings. And when you begin to read the actual words of the Chinese Communist Party, things like the Tiananmen Papers, these are Chinese Communist Party documents that have been leaked, because most things that the Chinese Communist Party does are done in secret. They were leaked and translated, and they really give you insight into the way the party thinks. And the party thinks in terms of its own preservation of power. And the biggest challenge that they have to their own preservation of power is the fact that they always run the risk of their population viewing them as illegitimate. Now, one of the ways that they continue to have legitimacy is by having continuous economic growth. So as long as they're providing economic growth for the Chinese people, they feel confident that they can suppress their desire for any hope for freedom. At the same time, they're constantly concerned about the idea of universal freedoms gaining purchase within China. And so they seek to suppress those abroad. Now, as they become more connected economically, financially, and through informational means, then they have the ability to reach in outside of their borders and actually influence societies in ways. So while we were focused on industrial policy in the Defense Department, I began to see that it was not just from an industrial basis that we were losing. It was also from an ideological basis, from a media basis, from a political basis. Now, if you trace this back to how, Western countries think of warfare and how we think of the division between peacetime and wartime, then you go back to some of the scholars. For instance, Clausewitz. Clausewitz was a Prussian scholar that said war is politics by other means. Jomini, another scholar that said apply mass at the weakest point. And Duhay was an airman, an early airman that said use an airplane. So I'm an airman. So this is repeated over and over in our professional military education. But if you look at the world in the way that the Chinese strategists do, you get a much different view of the world. Sun Tzu had The Art of War. If you read The Art of War, the book is much less about war and really how to defeat your opponent without actually going to war. How do you use guile? How do you use espionage? How do you get your adversaries to fight amongst themselves? The consummate general in Sun Tzu's world is a general that can win without fighting. And in fact, Mao Zedong was a great historian of Chinese literature, particularly of the Warring States period. And he really studied a lot of the works at this time, which is also about using guile, using stratagems to defeat your opponent without having to fight, because ultimately fighting is very risky. Now, Mao Zedong patterned this idea about fighting war differently and created the concept known as People's War. In People's War, you can take Clausewitz's idea of war as politics by other means and kind of turn it on its head and say, politics is war by other means. In other words, you use political warfare, ideological warfare, and you use it because, in his case, he was the weaker of the two systems. So they were fighting during their civil war. The Nationalist Party, who was much stronger and had weapons from the United States and had the backing of the United States. And of course, he didn't have those things. But what he did have was the ability to undermine the faith and confidence of the Chinese people in the Nationalist Party. And so that's what he used. And he got a lot of the generals under Chiang Kai-shek to essentially leave his service. And over time, they were victorious. Now, he used this idea of People's War to stir up a revolutionary fervor within China when he was losing power and caused the deaths of tens of millions of Chinese in the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward. So he was in many ways a tyrant, but a tyrant to his own people. But the ideas of People's War never left. And in fact, they were adopted and expanded in a document in 1999 that was written by two People's Liberation Army colonels. And these two colonels wrote what I would consider the most forward-looking strategic document in terms of thinking about the world, where it's going, and how a nation gains advantage that I've seen to date. I read it in 1999. I didn't quite understand it. But during this time, as we were studying this competition, I reread it and I began to realize that they had laid out a very good path for understanding how do you take People's War and really extend it into the globalized, internet-connected world. So not just undermining the faith and confidence of democracy for the Chinese people, it is how do you undermine the faith and confidence of democracy in people that live in a democracy. And part of that, it goes hand in hand with offsetting the ability to have jobs that came with the swapping of the industrial base from the United States to China. So in the process of losing our ability to provide the components for the weapon systems that we were building, we lost over 70,000 factories. That resulted in millions of jobs lost, manufacturing jobs. And if you go to a manufacturing facility, typically that's been around for a while, what you're going to find are a lot of employees that have worked there for a long time and have health and retirement benefits. So you were actually creating damage to the American society, while at the same time damaging our industrial capability. Into that flowed things like fentanyl that come out of Chinese pharmaceutical factories, because in China, that production is not curtailed, because the Chinese Communist Party really wants to keep the people in those factories employed. And if they can make money selling fentanyl in the United States, then they're going to allow them to do it. Really, if you think about it economically, in China, there's such a laissez-faire system that anything's okay as long as it doesn't counter the party. So we come to today, and you say, okay, well, where is this headed? And I would say that the coronavirus outbreak has really given us a chance to kind of reassess and really accelerated some of the elements of the national security strategy, which is really about strengthening democracies' efforts to reconnect their economies, their finance, their trade, and really their internet, so that we are more focused on our relationship with democracies than we are with totalitarian regimes. Now, the federal government's been executing this since about the first quarter of 2018, and they've had very good success. 3 months ago, I was in Berlin and Brussels, and I talked to everybody that handles 5G in the German government. And they really recognize the challenge to their own democracy that the Chinese Communist Party posed. And I went to Berlin or Brussels and talked to NATO and the EU, and they're focused on this as well. Now, with the introduction of the coronavirus and the challenges that we're seeing, both in terms of medicines here in the United States, where 90% of the precursors for our pharmaceuticals are made in China. Almost all of if not all of the antibiotics are made in China. And of course, now with the inability to get masks from China, we understand the challenges, not just from a national security perspective, but a health and wellness perspective. So my book is really about Stealth War, is about telling the story about all of these things that me and my team learned over that 5-year period at the Pentagon, and really provide some background and context for why the national security is the way it is and what we need to do. And I'll close by just giving a few examples of the things that it calls for in the national security strategy and in the book. And that is really about bringing back American manufacturing to protect our supply chains. It's really about investing in infrastructure. So in addition to the 70,000 factories we lost, we are $5 trillion in arrears in infrastructure. The American Civil Engineering Association gives it a grade of D+ for our infrastructure. On STEM education, we educated our scientists and engineers with federal grants for things like the space race. And on research and development, we were spending 2% of gross domestic product on basic science research. Silicon Valley, Boston, Austin, these are all places that benefited from the federal government's investment in basic science research that we've essentially stopped since the end of the Cold War. So getting back into spending more than on ships and planes and tanks and submarines, and spending that money on growing our manufacturing capability, growing our infrastructure, and growing our science and technology capability is really where the competition seeks to take us. Of course, we are getting strong pushback from those that say that we don't do industrial policy, despite the fact that nations all over the world do industrial policy. Companies like Samsung in Korea, companies like TSMC, very powerful, technologically sophisticated companies, are part of industrial policy programs. The auto manufacturing in Germany, just about everything in China. And so the idea that the United States doesn't do industrial policy is really not looking at the world as it is, rather than as we would like it to be. And then finally, in the last part of my time at the White House, I really worked on the challenge of open data and how that affects our society. Now, that's really about 5G. 5G is a technology that seeks to displace the smartphone as a computing for the apps, services, and business models for the future. In 2017, when I was a defense attaché in Beijing, you could order food on an app, on a WeChat app on your phone, and then put your phone away, and you'd walk into the restaurant, and a camera would see your face, do facial recognition, and the server would hand you your food and greet you by name. Now, the idea is to build that into the cities of tomorrow so that, you know, when you come outside your house, rather than using an app on your phone to call an Uber, you just say Uber. The camera picks up your face, does facial recognition. The camera reads your lips, or maybe a microphone picks up that call for an Uber, or you wave your hand and make a gesture, and that's translated into a call for an Uber that's probably not with a driver, and it speeds you on your way. The challenge today is that data is available in our system, both the tech companies and the Chinese Communist Party. And so the Chinese Communist Party seeks to take those algorithms, the algorithms that are used to influence you to buy more shoes or send you ads in your on your web pages when you're reading news, and use that to incentivize you to like a political party, like a political system, like a particular politician. Now, they use this within China and with something called a social credit score. I call it Six Sigma fascism, because it actually seeks to essentially automatically suppress the outliers in society, your creators, those that don't want to conform to society's norms, and tries to create a good citizen automatically by incentivizing you. And so if you smoke, if you drink, if you jaywalk, if you have bad friends, your score goes down, and then you can't get on public transportation. You have to pay more for your goods. Your kids can't get into schools. That's what China is doing with these wonderful technologies and business models created by Silicon Valley, but they also seek to export those to the world. And they export those by dominating the platform and having the dominant AI systems in the world. So Kai-Fu Lee, their leading artificial intelligence researcher, says that China is to data as Saudi Arabia is to oil. Their idea is to control the world's data, and they do that by owning the platform. So you say, well, we're just going to not have Huawei built. Well, that's okay, because 3GPP, which is the industry standard making body, so it's an organization where companies like AT&T and Verizon, T-Mobile and Qualcomm and Intel and Samsung and Ericsson and Nokia and Huawei and ZTE all come together to build the network of tomorrow. They're building on a common network. So it doesn't matter if it's Huawei or not. The network is common. It's built according to the same standards. These are the same open data standards that allows Facebook to have all this data on you, and Amazon and Google. These companies are under the run from Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, which are the Chinese equivalents. This is why Facebook, Amazon, and Google have artificial intelligence research center in China, because they have access to data that they don't have in the West. And so the idea is really to bring in these companies, to take their technology, just like I saw in 2014 in that briefing, to bring it in, to suck them in, and to eventually dominate in them. So in 10 years, what the Chinese plan is to have Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent be the dominant tech companies in the world. And when they have that, they'll have the power to influence you in ways, in much more subtle ways than just trying to get the general manager of the Houston Rockets fired because he said something about the people of Hong Kong. So I think I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to start taking questions, because it is a very broad and difficult to understand subject. But I guarantee you, if you read the book, you're going to get a pretty good understanding of the challenges that we face as a nation today.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Brigadier General. We have a lot of questions here. I'll start off with a quick one. We have a question looking at what was the treaty you mentioned that you read in 1999 and didn't understand at the time, but now sees as having been especially prescient?
Yeah, it's unrestricted warfare. You can actually find it online. I don't know if there's a way that I can share a link, but it is. You can find the PDF online. The two riders are Chao Liang, and I can't remember the other. I remember Chao Liang. He's the one that got promoted to general. Of course, the Chinese Communist Party will tell you that that document really doesn't represent the way we act. But of course, he is teaching at their National Defense University and got promoted to general. So that gives you some indication of what they think about his ideas.
Okay. You talked a lot about different companies. So what, if any, responsibility do American companies have to support U.S. interests in a similar way as Chinese companies supporting their country's interests?
Well, that's a really good question. In fact, companies in the United States are responsible to their shareholders. So they have a fiduciary responsibility by law. They have to maximize value for the shareholder. And this is one of the ways that the Chinese Communist Party is able to co-opt them. Because they use a market pool of 1.4 billion Chinese and sometimes financial incentives to bring them in. And in a lot of ways, they're captured because once you're in China, the money invested there has to stay there. And so it's very hard to bring that money home. And at the same time, because everybody believes economic growth is going to come primarily out of China, then any board of directors or any executives in the C-suite are going to be focused on investing in China and being involved in the Chinese market. So it's very difficult in our system. And then, of course, in addition to that, we actually allow things that are beneficial for China by incentivizing our corporations to do that. So not only does China incentivize them to come over, but our accounting standards, for example, for corporations, even though those assets are forced to stay in China, they're allowed to keep them on their books as level 1 assets, which means they're counted against their 10Qs and 10Ks and their quarterly and annual financial statements, and actually correspond to the earnings of the executives and the directors. And so this is a challenge that we have looked at in the federal government. But to this date, we haven't been able to fix because U.S. corporations want to continue to be in China and be incentivized in that way. The corporate directors and executives want to be paid for the money they're making in China, even though that money must stay there.
Okay, we've got another question here, sort of down the manufacturing route. So do you think the U.S. should take the manufacturing of our pharmaceuticals from China? And what are the challenges to doing so?
So I absolutely do believe that we need to manufacture our own pharmaceuticals. Not only is it possible for them to block export, which they have threatened during this coronavirus campaign, but it also means that you don't have insight into the impurities that sometimes come up in those drugs. And there's been quite a lot of evidence of impurities that are in there. And there's a good book called Made Poorly in China that I highly recommend, which will give you an idea of how the Chinese companies actually do things. If they can get away with something, they will. And so sometimes this causes people a great harm. So I do believe that we need to bring it back. The way we bring it back is by, first of all, preventing corporations from sending their stuff over there. And you can do that by incentivizing rather than punishing. So you can put a combination of tariffs and use what's called the Defense Production Act to incentivize companies to bring back manufacturing. That's what the president announced. That actually was discussed in our national security strategy. It was discussed, during my time in the Pentagon, and it seems like we're finally starting to get on track. The Defense Production Act was used during World War II and the Cold War to do essentially industrial policy in the United States. So some of the things that are critical to national security or the health and welfare of Americans, even Adam Smith said, if it has to do with national security, there may be a time when a country has to act in its own favor when it comes to this idea of free trade, particularly in the case of China, because they are not a free trade economy.
All right, we have a question from Mark Galloway. Militarily, can China, defend their supply lines and be offensive outside the chain of islands?
Well, No. And there's two reasons. One is the Straits of Malacca is where the majority of trade flows through in the Pacific, and of course that's easily blocked by submarine warfare. They know that, which is why they've been working on the Belt and Road Initiative, which will give them landward supply lines. So they're trying to create internal supply lines to defend that. Offensively outside the chain of islands, no, they're typically defending their position all the way out to the second island chain now. But if you think about it, in a world where there's three things: nuclear weapons, globalization, and the internet. Nuclear weapons really makes war between like-weaponed opponents very dangerous and risky for everybody. And so globalization and the internet is really the way to compete. And so although they don't have the ability to go offensive outside their borders, in a traditional sense, they do in a 21st century sense, because while they don't have tanks rolling down 435, the Beltway in DC, what they do have is they're in all our networks. They're in all our data. That's where our challenge lies. We lose $300 to $600 billion in intellectual property theft per year. Our population is being influenced on a daily basis. These are the battlefields of the 21st century, and they are far more capable than the United States is at waging war in those areas.
Okay. You mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative. So given China's huge investment in global infrastructure through its Belt and Road Initiative, what are your thoughts about countries that have accepted their money to build roads, bridges, etc.? Will these dozens of countries be subjugated to China in the coming years?
Yes, that's a really good question. In fact, McKinsey did a great study on this, and they actually came and briefed it while I was at the White House. And it was the conclusion of the study was we should partner with China in Africa, and it was talking about Africa, and what they laid out in what China was doing in Africa was absolutely stunning. The main investment in Africa at the time, this was 2017, was in low value added manufacturing. I was actually quite shocked. 30% of investment was in low value added manufacturing. And when you started to look at the pattern of what they were doing in China, first they would identify a resource like a mine. Then they would identify how they get it to their market. So how do you get a raw material to China's manufacturing? So they would build the mine, they would build a port, they would build railroads, they would build highways, they would build telecommunications and water and power. And if you think about it, then they had all the skeletal pieces of an industrialized economy. So they were bringing low value added manufacturing into these places in Africa. And so they were tying an ecosystem together, both in terms of resources for China, but also in markets, future markets for China. And so these low value added manufacturing, the next stage was urbanization. And they were, and then what comes next is a lot of the automation that I talked about with the social credit score. So cameras that are powered by artificial intelligence. They were selling smartphones at $50 a pop. That were the software is modified to take better selfies for dark complected faces. And when you looked at it, they were engineered an entire ecosystem so that they could take a pre-industrialized economy all the way up through an industrialized economy to an information economy, and then connect that directly with China. And they had, because they have a digital Silk Road, which they've laid half the undersea cables, and they're also laying the fiber in these countries and building 5G networks. Now they have access to all the data. So their technology companies were going to be dominant. Their high value added manufacturing in China was going to be dominant, and they were going to basically create this very tightly wound ecosystem that is actually quite brilliant if you think about it. And so I think what they're going to continue to be successful at that, because these countries see it's beneficial for them. Of course, I asked the McKinsey folks, okay, who did you interview when you did this study? And the answer was, well, we interviewed the leaders of the government and we interviewed the owners of the businesses. Of course, those were Chinese. And I said, did you interview the people? And the answer was, well, every once in a while I talk to a taxi driver. So in a lot of ways, it was representative of the way we look at globalization today. We don't actually understand the underlying social and cultural implications of what's going on. So China is creating an ability to export its IT-based authoritarianism, lock, stock, and barrel to its proxies in the developing world, and it's going to be quite powerful, and it already has been quite powerful.
All right, we've got a question harkening back to the pharmaceuticals. If we bring back our manufacturing of pharmaceuticals, won't the cost of medicine skyrocket?
No, I think this is part of the pattern of information that's just not presenting an accurate picture of the world. So whatever low cost production you're getting in China is actually not low cost in the sense that it's being subsidized by the government. So a lot of these factories get subsidized electricity. A lot of that electricity is generated by power plants that have scrubbers that don't get turned on because they bribe the inspectors not. So they're spewing waste into the environment, and a lot of it uses low labor regulations for the labor. So yes, you are getting a low price product, but you're getting it because you're essentially allowing that company to exploit labor and pollute the environment. The Chinese Communist Party is still building coal-fired plants without scrubbers, some of them across their borders in countries like Vietnam, and polluting those countries and then carrying the electrical power across the border. So this is the very bad part of it. But the truth of the matter is, in the United States today, you have some of the lowest energy costs in the OECD, if not the lowest. You have low corporate tax rates. You have opportunity zones all over the country. You have communities that are clamoring for this type of manufacturing. And then you have the increase of automation in a lot of these manufacturing. So the reality is it's not cheaper to manufacture in China. It's that the government subsidizes these corporations to continue to have employment in China. And so you won't see drugs skyrocket. You may see a little bit of a price, but the little bit of a price increase that you're paying for means that we're not polluting the environment and we're not exploiting labor.
All right, our next question is
better quality.
Yeah. So next question is, do you think the coronavirus is an intentional act by China or others to disrupt the global economy?
So I've seen a number of research papers written that dispute that it was actually created. And the research paper themselves rely on conjecture about what the possible exploratory paths of researchers might be if they were creating a bioweapon. The challenge is we just don't know. And we have no way of knowing because the Chinese Communist Party has prevented the Center for Disease Control experts from actually going to Wuhan, the site of the epicenter of the spread of the virus. And they've prevented them from looking in the Wuhan P4 lab. They've prevented them from talking to the researchers. And unless we do a forensics investigation of how the coronavirus came about, we're not going to know. And so this is the challenge of having a totalitarian regime in our midst. So if you look at the actual spread of the coronavirus itself, 1 week, if we just carved off 1 week earlier a knowledge of this, we get 66% less infection globally. 2 weeks, 84%. 3 weeks, 95% less infection globally if we deal with it in China at the epicenter. So, this is a challenge we have. They destroyed the samples. They have hid research about it. They have systematically prevented our researchers from going in and finding out the truth. This is what the Chinese Communist Party does. And we are now facing economic calamity in this country and number of deaths of Americans because the Chinese Communist Party hid the truth about the coronavirus.
Right. I think this will be our last question. Much of what you've said about China's attempts to show divisiveness in the US applies to Russia as well. To what extent is China working with Russia to disrupt American democracy? Are they coordinating their efforts to do this?
I don't have direct evidence of their coordination, but I would say that they learn from each other and that their actions are symbiotic. So what the Russians do is called atomization. They seek to create chaos in a country by putting the citizens of that country against each other, by sowing divisiveness. What the Chinese do prior to the coronavirus, because they've started to institute some of these more in-your-face propagandizing moves that the Russians do. But prior to the coronavirus, they do obfuscation. They hide things. So think about it this way. There's a good example of distraction where a number of guys get together and pass a basketball, and you're told to watch the basketball being bounced around and count how many times it's bounced. And in the middle of this, a guy in a gorilla suit walks out and kind of waves his arms and walks away, and you never see him. This is the net effect between the two. The Russians create a lot of noise, they create a lot of chaos, and the Chinese are very quiet about what they do, and they influence very quietly through obfuscation. A lot of their contracts are signed in secret. A lot of their payoffs are done in secret. A lot of their deals are made in secret, and so we don't really know what's going on. And if you out them, then they'll come after you. So if you're a corporation like Apple, and you like Google or any of those other corporations that may try to go against them, they're going to punish you. They're going to cut off access. They're going to make it harder for you to do business in China. And this is a challenge that our corporations, they're solely responsible for fiduciary responsibility to the shareholder, and this makes them extremely vulnerable to that kind of behavior.
All right, we have one more comment come in that I think is a good one. Can you comment on the accusation by Iran, and I believe by China as well, that the coronavirus is an attack by the US?
Yeah, if you look at, and this is what we were looking at when we were constructing the national security strategy. If you look at Iran, North Korea, and Russia, for example, they all have very strong economic and financial relationships with China. So, the idea was that we would deal with each of these, what we would typically consider to be military challenges first before going after China. And what you realize is that as China grows in economic strength, these three satellites are used to increase our defense budget to deal with these challenges in three different regions. So in the Pacific, it's North Korea. In the Middle East, it's Iran. And in Europe, it's Russia. And when you have the combined, $800 billion of the U.S. Defense budget going after these things, they're not being invested in your economy. They're not manufacturing things. Your infrastructure continues to erode. You don't spend on STEM education and research and development. And so what the Chinese actually like to see, they want to see, is us to continue to increase our defense spending, to not spend on our own economy and our own people. Now, if you go back to the Cold War, that's exactly what we did to the Soviets, and why, as we were looking at this in the Pentagon, it seems so brilliant, because rather than fighting us in a war, they were essentially, through our own efforts to bring democracy to the world, bankrupting us and perpetuating that through these endless conflicts that we have in the Middle East. So it's really, can we reestablish that way of thinking about national security, where the military is really about deterring major conflict, but really focusing on growing our economy and growing our science and technology base, and really investing in our economy and our people. That's what the national security strategy is about. But we have a hard time today implementing it, because if you go back to when Eisenhower left, his final speech, he said, "Beware the undue influence of the military-industrial complex. There is incredible incentive for us to continue to do the things that have, essentially been powering that economy for over 3 decades."
All right. Well, thank you very much. We've come to our hour here. We really appreciate Brigadier General Robert Spalding giving us his time, working with us on our first ever World Affairs Council live event. We hope that you have enjoyed it, and we hope that you will continue to learn more about the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, our offerings, and what we do. Thank you again for everyone who joined us here tonight, and we look forward to our next event.
Thank you so much. Good night.